Good afternoon. Welcome to Medicine Grand Rounds. In recognition of the Holocaust and with the assistance of the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, we have two speakers that are going to present different perspectives on the Holocaust. We have Rebecca Carter Chand, a historian from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, who is going to present her comments on courage and compromise among professionals during the Holocaust. Dr. Chan received her bachelor's degree from Crandall University, a master's in history from Queen's University, and a PhD from the University of Toronto. Dr. Chan works at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and is the director of programs on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust. Our second speaker, Dr. Susannah Sirkin, is the director of policy at Physicians for Human Rights. Dr. Sirkin received her bachelor's degree in European Studies from Mount Holyoke College and her master's in education from Boston University. She has focused her career on several issues in bioethics, specifically medical consequences of human rights violations, physical evidence of human rights abuse, and physician complicity in violations. She will focus her comments today on decisions related to courage or compliance as it relates to health professionals in which they're faced with in their daily practice. So welcome both Dr. Carter Chan and Dr. Sirkin. Dr. Carter Chan will make her comments first.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Schwartz. Thank you for having me here. This is a real honor. So I'd like to start right away launching with a story. When reports that institutionalized psychiatric patients were being killed reached Paul Brana and his colleagues in February 1940, they weren't sure if they were true. Now, Brana was an ordained minister, but he served as the director of the Hofmannsthal institutions and the vice president of the Central Committee of the Inner Mission, the main Protestant welfare organization in Germany. Brana was very concerned with these rumors and spent 2.5 months carefully looking into the rumors. He was able to uncover a pretty accurate profile of what was going on. That thousands of people with mental disabilities were being killed and their remains cremated. At the time, he did not know the means of the killing, but he was able to amass evidence of the systematic nature of the killings. And what he decided to do with his knowledge, I think, is instructive in understanding the state of German society at the time. Brana thought that if he presented a thorough report with well-documented findings and formally submitted it to the Reich Chancellery, it would prompt the government to halt the program. And this is really in line with a common sentiment when ordinary Germans encountered repressive or unjust practices coming from the regime. They naively thought that if only Hitler knew, he would not stand for it. So on July 9th, 1940, he submitted a 12-page memorandum to Hitler, the contents of which both assessed the situation and protested it. He summed it up as shocking and actions that were unworthy of a healing and care facility. Now, Brana was not the only one within the Inner Mission's leadership that was concerned. But the other Central Council members were more hesitant to confront the government, as was Brana's close friend, seen here in the photo, Friedrich von Bodelschwingh, a director of the well-known Bethel institutions. And so here we see competing loyalties leading to compromises. Bodelschwingh was committed to rescuing his patients in Bethel and saving the Bethel institutions themselves. He refused to sign forms that would have authorized the transfer of patients to be killed. He was also a nationalistic German and had sworn loyalty to Germany and its leader. He and Braune both believed the euthanasia program was immoral and without legal basis, but it was only Braune whose name appears on the report. Braune was arrested by the Gestapo on August 12th, although they denied that it had anything to do with the memo because they were anxious to hide the very existence of the program. But Braune was released after 3 months and survived the war. In his correspondence to other church colleagues, he made it clear why he was willing to go out on a limb. In a letter to Bodelschwingh, he reflected on the possibility of attacks in response to his memo. He said, and I quote here, "In any case, to this point, I have done what I could and have tried to ensure that the voice of the church will not remain silent in these ongoing negotiations." So Braune and Bodelschwingh have been remembered differently for their choices. And I think this is worth highlighting at the outset. Both worked through their contacts in the government and professional circles, believing that most of these people were fundamentally decent. Both refused to hand over patients in the institutions that they ran. But Braune definitely took more risks by writing and submitting this memorandum. And many people, both at the time and later on, believe that Bodelschwingh could have done more and could have effected more change due to his prominence. So stories like this of rescue and resistance are among the most compelling and popular narratives told about the Holocaust. For better or worse, they tend to highlight individual courage, moral clarity, altruism, and solidarity. Often they serve a didactic purpose, inspiring people to develop compassion and a strong moral compass, as well as honoring those people who did some measure of good during very difficult times. As the filmmaker and child Holocaust survivor Pierre Sauvage has cautioned, if we remember solely the horror of the Holocaust, it is we who bear the responsibility for having created the most dangerous alibi of all, that it was beyond man's capacity to know and care. And so today I'm going to describe a few cases in which people in Nazi Germany did know and care, at least about one element of the Nazis' overall destructive project. So the Nazi euthanasia program, just to orient ourselves, if you're unfamiliar with this history, the Nazi euthanasia program was the systematic and clandestine murder of institutionalized patients with disabilities in Germany. It was one of many eugenic measures that aimed to restore and enhance the so-called racial integrity of the German nation or German folk. And it aimed to eliminate people whom eugenicists considered lives unworthy of life, it's in quotation marks, because they were seen as a genetic and financial burden on German society. So I really want to underscore that Nazi Germany first crossed this line from persecution to mass murder, not with the Jews, but with people considered disabled. And these two programs of systematic murder are linked in several really important ways, not least of which is how the euthanasia program served as a means of experimentation and training for later forms of mass murder of Jews. It began with children in the spring of 1939 and quickly extended to adults. Hitler signed a secret authorization in the autumn of 1939 and backdated it to September 1st to suggest somehow that it was related to wartime measures. It wasn't, but this did allow for less public scrutiny. The organizers tried to keep the killings secret, but word got out. There were staff at the facilities, there were the communities located around the facilities, and there were the families who received letters notifying them of a relative's death. And sometimes these explanations raised red flags, like the famous case where a family received a notification that a family member had died of appendicitis in an institution when the family knew that, in fact, the patient had had their appendix removed years earlier. So after protests from German citizens, some of the most vocal of these coming from church circles, Hitler ordered a halt to the program in late August 1941. At that time, over 70,000 Germans had been killed, but the program continued under more secrecy until the very end of the war, and the total number killed is over 250,000. So in this history, as we look for role models, those who showed some measure of moral courage in the face of such blatant disregard for human life, it's important not to put them up on a pedestal. We need to ask really critical questions about their political and social context. Why were some people punished harshly and others allowed to get away with more protest? Was one more courageous than the other? Where are the spaces to speak truth to power? How do different people assess their options and make decisions? Is it better to work within the system or leave it when it becomes too morally compromised? Finally, and probably most importantly for me as a historian and a museum professional who speaks about this history with the public, what blinders did people have? What do we do when we encounter someone from the past who exhibited moral courage in one area and was morally compromised or complicit in another area? And how does this affect memory and educational efforts around this history? Before going any further, I want to provide you with a bit more context about the churches in Germany, because the churches were really pillars of German society and played an important role in shaping people's attitudes and actions. The vast majority of Germans belonged to a Christian church. Approximately 2/3 were Protestant, 1/3 Catholic, just under 1% Jewish, and less than 1% belonged to other Christian traditions, such as Mennonites, Quakers, Baptists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Seventh-day Adventists. So in Germany, a person was born into a religious confession, and normally they were baptized, confirmed. They received either Protestant or Roman Catholic religious instruction in school, and they paid church taxes. After World War I, the new Weimar Constitution stated that there was no state church, but in effect, these two churches were still very closely tied to the state. They received subsidies and church taxes. And so when Hitler came to power in 1933, most Christians welcomed this. They were shaped by many factors. Of course, nationalism, certainly anti-communism, a real backlash against the Weimar Republic and the liberal tradition that it stood for. There were traditional loyalties to governing authority, and of course, the convergence of Nazi anti-Semitism with longstanding and deep-seated anti-Jewish prejudice in the Christian tradition, both Catholic and Protestant. Hitler was very pragmatic about public opinion in general, and he made a lot of efforts to reassure Christians in the early days. In 1933, Germany signed a concordat, or a treaty, with the Holy See, and Hitler, who was a baptized Catholic himself, promised to respect the rights of Catholics and the Catholic Church in Germany. The Vatican and Pope Pius XI hoped to protect Catholic interests and also benefit from the Nazi regime, acting as a defense against communism in Europe. The German Catholic hierarchy was quite critical of Nazism early on, but found some ways of compromising. And when this concordat was signed, it really undermined any potential Catholic opposition. Going very quickly through this history, but on the Protestant side of things, there were some efforts to create a national Protestant church. And some within the church, they came to be known as the German Christian movement. They sought to align the church with Nazism. Others fought for the institutional autonomy and theological integrity of the church. This was known as the Confessing Church. Overall, the churches remained independent institutions throughout the Third Reich, and since 1945, have really had to come to terms with their complicity in the Nazi era. There were very small numbers of individuals within each of these Christian communities who resisted Nazism or rescued Jews, but they did so individually or in informal networks without institutional support. And this is really important for understanding the decision-making process for those in leadership positions, as we're considering today, when they came up against these real ethical challenges related to the Nazi euthanasia program. The churches had long supported positive eugenics, that is, encouraging healthy individuals and populations. But the euthanasia discussion among eugenicists, which predated the Nazi era, certainly, this discussion for those who advocated for mercy killing or ending the lives of people with severe disabilities, this posed a real challenge to the churches. Both the Protestant and Catholic churches owned and operated hundreds of hospitals, orphanages, care homes, and other institutions for the mentally and physically disabled and elderly. Hitler feared that opposition from the churches might make it politically too costly to implement the euthanasia killings. And he was right to some degree. There was opposition, although it was overshadowed by the dramatic unfolding of the war. And of course, this timing was very much intentional. Few leaders of church-supported institutions supported euthanasia in any form. There were formal teachings about the sanctity of life. Moreover, their life's work was based on a deep respect for life and upon the Christian mandate to minister and care for those less fortunate. But people were divided between those who wanted the church to protest publicly and those who hoped to end the euthanasia program by reaching some arrangement with the government, as we saw in the story about Braune and Bodelschwing. Overall, the response by the institutional churches was slow and hesitant. As Paul Braune himself explained, the official church remained completely silent. The official intermission also did not dare to do anything. When I was released, the treasurer of the intermission reproached me for having gone out on a limb over the matter. The Catholic Church also took a hesitant approach. Protests were limited to behind the scenes and through official channels. Moreover, the church tended to seek compromises rather than denounce the program as a whole. For example, trying to get priests exempted from participating in the program, or to try to secure agreement for the provision of the sacraments for those to be killed. Now, this didn't end up happening, but if it had, it really would have looked like the church was condoning the program. The Vatican did issue a statement in December 1940, and I quote from it: "The direct killing of an innocent person because of mental or physical defects is not allowed." It was very clear in its stance, but it did not name the program or condemn it outright. So this is the context in which the actions of one Catholic bishop really stand out. And that is the Bishop of Münster, Catholic Bishop of Münster, von Galen, who in August 1941 decided to take a public stand against these killings, which was prompted by the removal of mental patients from his own diocese. That summer, Galen preached 3 sermons from the pulpit that criticized the Nazi regime, and this third one really went into detail about the euthanasia program, making several arguments as to why it was wrong and why Germans should oppose it. The shocking sermon was illegally reproduced and circulated all over Germany, greatly increasing its reach and inspiring many others in German resistance circles. And to read this sermon is really, really interesting. He makes several arguments. First, he appeals to the German Penal Code, which stated that a person who receives credible information concerning the intention to commit a crime against life and does not report it will be punished. He also rebuts arguments about the drain on resources to have unproductive members of society by arguing that anyone could potentially fall into that category, whether by age or injury. And I've copied one small part of the sermon here on the slide. He said, if it is once accepted that people have the right to kill unproductive fellow humans, then even if it initially only affects the poor, defenseless, mentally ill, then as a matter of principle, murder is permitted for all unproductive people. In other words, for the incurably sick, the people who have become invalids through labor and war, for us all when we become old, frail, and therefore unproductive. So you might notice that with both of these arguments, it's nothing that is particularly Catholic or even religious in his arguments. But nevertheless, they coming from a bishop and being preached in a sermon from the pulpit, they had a very strong effect. The Nazi authorities were furious about Galen's sermon, and they debated what to do. In the end, they decided that, at least during the remainder of the war, they wanted to preserve appearances with the church, and they chose a less harsh response. Galen was put under house arrest for the remainder of the war, but he did survive and was even promoted to a cardinal in 1946. And here's the really important part for how we remember Galen and his actions. He never spoke out about the persecution of the Jews. He, in fact, harbored some typical anti-Semitic ideas of his day, and that legacy really overshadows all of what I've just described here, and really makes him a controversial figure in the history of the churches and the Holocaust. And so to return to our title of our event today, which names Courage, Complicity, Compromise, what I hope that I've shown today is that these things are not mutually exclusive. I haven't given you, 3 different case studies demonstrating each one, but have tried to show how these dynamics were present in various scenarios. And along with the medical profession and the judiciary, the other institution most closely entangled with the Nazi euthanasia program was the churches. And so along with doctors and nurses, we need to consider the institutional structure of medical and care facilities and the intersections between religious professionals and medical professionals who share a professional duty to act according to ethical standards. So I hope that you will identify some common struggles and common commitments in your own professions, and that these stories from the past might help you orient yourselves in your own 21st century context. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's truly an honor to be here today, and I just want to say that I wish I were a doctor, but I'm not. I'm a Ms. Sirkin. I have enormous admiration for doctors and all of those of you who are here in the health professions. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this really important grand rounds today. I'm going to speak mostly about the courage of doctors, and there will be allusions to issues of compromise and complicity as well. The United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights emerged as a result of the Holocaust, when nations asserted the inherent dignity and rights of all human beings. And the World Medical Association was formed after the Holocaust in 1947 to create global codes of ethics following the revelations of medical complicity in Nazi atrocities. Now, much has been written and said about the active colluders as well as the many bystanders, those who remained silent, including in the medical profession. But what I want to talk about today is, what does it take to speak out and do more than speak, but actively oppose atrocities? In his study of rescuers during the Holocaust, especially, psychologist Irvin Staub wrote, "Goodness, like evil, often begins in small steps. Heroes evolve. They aren't born. And very often, rescuers made only a small commitment at the start to hide someone for a day or two. But once they had taken that step, they began to see themselves differently as someone who helps. What starts as mere willingness, he says, becomes intense involvement. And so I think the same could be true of the doctors that I'm going to highlight today. 6 specific cases from a range of medical specialties who stepped up in the face of racism, human rights abuse, and violence in the decades following the Holocaust. After the year we've all lived through, the lessons learned from the challenges and decisions that these doctors made could not be more profound or more relevant. And perhaps these physicians and many others could form the basis of a wall of honor rather than one of shame. So what caused a doctor to take personal and professional risks to oppose the status quo, to tell the truth in the face of pressure to hide it? How did their colleagues and the medical establishment respond to their actions? And what impact can a doctor's actions have not only on his or her patients, but on entire communities? Now, Wendy Orr was a 25-year-old recent graduate of the University of Cape Town, South Africa, when she took her position as a district surgeon in Port Elizabeth in 1985. That July, a state of emergency was declared in her district and others due to growing unrest and opposition to apartheid. Thousands were detained. Dr. Orr's father, it turns out, was a Presbyterian minister, and Orr has said that she grew up quite aware of gross injustices based on the color of people's skin. But she had not been politically active as a medical student, though she had belonged to a group that worked to help residents in Black townships. Dr. Orr's job as a district surgeon included conducting autopsies at the police mortuary and providing clinical services to detainees. In her work, she regularly observed evidence of torture, such as whip marks, lacerations, bruising, and periorbital hematomas. Her turning point came about when she shared some of her experiences with these cases with a visiting human rights lawyer. He presented her with 2 options. In her words, I could continue being a good doctor, recording and treating injuries and doing nothing to prevent them, or I could do something that no district surgeon had done before, take my evidence to the Supreme Court and seek an urgent interdict to prevent police from assaulting and torturing detainees. So she submitted her affidavit to the Supreme Court, which was central to a 1985 decision to restrain police from assaulting detainees. In her conclusion, she wrote, and it's here on the slide, it ultimately became clear to me that unless I made a stand and did something about the plight of the detainees, I would be compromising my moral beliefs and my perception of my professional responsibility. My conscience told me that I could no longer stand by and do nothing. Following her actions, Dr. Orr was reassigned to so-called other duties so that she would no longer have contact with prisoners. She was also harassed. Dr. Orr received support eventually from medical associations outside of South Africa, but the Medical Association of South Africa, MASA, at the time did nothing to reach out to her or speak out for her. In the 1990s, Dr. Orr was appointed to serve on South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and she organized a critical hearing on the role of health professions in human rights in South Africa from 1960 to 1994. And she wrote at the end of that experience that the damage done to all of us by apartheid was that it treated Black people as something less than human, and it dehumanized white people because they came to believe that. Now, moving to the Soviet Union, let's turn to the case of Dr. Anatoly Koryogen and his confrontation with the perversion of psychiatry as a tool of repression. Throughout the 1970s, as dissidents began to agitate for their rights to freedom of information, expression, religion, ethnic and cultural identity, Soviet psychiatry created phony diagnoses and forcibly confined hundreds of political dissidents to psychiatric facilities. The diagnosis of sluggish schizophrenia included symptoms like mania for justice and reformist delusions. The dissidents were considered a danger to society. Many so-called patients were treated with psychoactive drugs. Dr. Koryogen formed an underground commission to investigate the use of psychiatry for political purposes, and he examined 55 dissidents subjected to this grotesque abuse. He published his findings in The Lancet and spoke out in other settings. And in 1981, Dr. Koryogen was arrested and sentenced to 7 years hard labor, followed by 5 years of internal exile. He was stripped of his Soviet citizenship. He spent time in prison under very harsh conditions and was himself forcibly treated with antipsychotic medications. Now, international psychiatry did respond. The American Psychiatric Association, the Royal College of Psychiatry, and the World Psychiatric Association came to his defense. They wrote to the Soviet leadership, and eventually the WPA expelled the Soviet Union as a member until it abolished these abhorrent practices. During his trial for anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, which was the official crime he was charged with, Dr. Koryogen told the court, regardless of the sentence imposed on me, and I know it will be harsh, I will never accept the situation that exists in our country where mentally healthy people are imprisoned in psychiatric hospitals for trying to think independently. I know that long years of imprisonment, humiliation, and mockery await me, but I embark on them in the hope that it will increase the chance of others to live in freedom. Dr. Koryogen was eventually released in 1987, and he immigrated to Switzerland. Koryogen actually made a huge sacrifice, as you've seen, to speak truth to power. His career was essentially ruined. Today, sadly, there is no longer the robust Human Rights Committee at the APA, and Koryogen's legacy is perhaps now under threat in today's Russia. Now I'd like to turn briefly to the ongoing story of Dr. Shebnem Fijanji, the current president of the Human Rights Foundation of Turkey. She's a professor and a specialist in forensic medicine in Istanbul. For decades, Turkish authorities have routinely inflicted torture on prisoners, including those rounded up for their human rights or political advocacy. And like Dr. Orr, Dr. Fijanji regularly saw victims of severe beatings, electric shock, and she conducted autopsies on those who died as a result of these cruelties. The consistent provision of forensic evidence of torture for the courts by Dr. Fijanji and her colleagues led to the creation of the Istanbul Protocol, which is the international standard for the documentation and prevention of torture. And many of my colleagues at PHR also contributed to the development of this very important standard. In Turkey, prison doctors were required not to report evidence of torture in the routine medical exam on a prisoner's release. Most doctors knew that this was wrong, and it troubled them. They knew that if they included the evidence so plainly before them, they could be fired, or worse, they themselves could have been arrested, prosecuted, and tortured themselves. So in the 1990s, we at PHR documented this wrongdoing, and we decided that rather than condemn these doctors, we would describe them as unwilling accomplices. And we found a way in this study to lift up their voices without putting them at risk by conducting an anonymous survey of forensic doctors at a national conference in Izmir, Turkey. The report that we produced, and this is the cover of it, revealed the conflicts that doctors had between their ethics and the government's oppressive demands. Dr. Fijanji herself has gotten into trouble with the authorities. She was arrested in 2016 and sentenced to prison in 2018 for campaigning for the rights of the Turkish Kurds and opposing actions of her government in Syria, all the time speaking out as a doctor with voices of many other doctors behind her. She was acquitted in 2019 and also was honored by us here. Denis Mukwege, a Congolese OBGYN trained in France, could have spent his career delivering babies. But in the late 1990s and the first decade of this century, as horrific violence erupted across the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, where he lived and worked, Dr. Mukwege, who had founded a small hospital in the town of Panzi, witnessed the medical sequelae of mass rape as a weapon of war in his country. Arriving at his surgery day after day were dozens of women and girls with their organs ripped out or mutilated and traumatic fistulas from gang sexual assaults by armed forces and militias. In addition to treating thousands of survivors of these crimes, he organized a multidisciplinary team for a holistic response. As he said, we can't treat just the finger or the ear. We have to treat the whole person. Dr. Mukwege realized quickly that taking care of patients one by one would not solve this crisis. So he became a voice for his patients and community, advocating at the UN, in New York and Geneva, in Brussels, at the EU, in Kinshasa, his country's capital, and in the media. He approached Physicians for Human Rights to help support access to justice for these crimes against humanity. And we have worked with him and his colleagues, bringing together doctors and police with prosecutors and judges for a coordinated legal and judicial response. Dr. Mukwege realized that using his voice for justice was the only way to stop the widespread impunity in his country and prevent further violence. You can't operate against violence, he has said. You can only abolish it. And for his work, he shared in the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize. But he has paid a price for his courage and his work. He survived an assassination attempt in 2012, and ongoing threats on his life continue. And for the past decade, he has essentially been confined to the compound of his hospital for security reasons. So he actually had to move his whole house and his family inside the compound of the hospital. Dr. Mukwege has become a global force for the rights and dignity of survivors of sexual violence, while he continues his clinical work at Panzi, repairing the trauma of these crimes. So now let's turn to the United States. Here are Dr. Pam Mcpherson, a child psychiatrist in Louisiana, and Dr. Scott Allen, an internist in California. Dr. Mcpherson says, I have never come across a medical school or residency applicant aspiring to be a whistleblower. But these two doctors were led to blow the whistle on the US government's notorious family detention program in 2018, when they served as medical consultants to the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. After failing with internal complaints, they consulted legal counsel and went public. In writing to members of Congress, decrying the impacts of the cruel migrant separation policy on children, they stated, the ethics of our profession are clear, that we have a professional duty not only to intervene to prevent physical and mental harm to children, but to speak out against assaults on their dignity as well. Where authority discriminates against vulnerable populations, to remain silent would mean complicity. And in a talk last year, Dr. Mcpherson noted and it's on the screen here, that being a whistleblower requires a skill set not taught in medical school. It may be thrust upon you when you least expect it and already have a full and busy life. It is a step that changes your life in ways you cannot even begin to imagine. Becoming a whistleblower creates additional burdens, but it eases the greater burden of silence. And when he was asked what prompted him to risk repercussions to blow the whistle, Scott Allen credited his work with PHR to document the ethical failings of health professionals who worked with the CIA and the military during the US torture campaign of the early 2000s. Last week, Scott wrote to me and he said, I thought to myself, how interesting life is. The roles are now reversed, and I find myself at the center of a different national security effort that was misguided and posed great harm, only this time to refugee children. And I understood the consequence of physicians failing to act in accordance with the ethics of their profession. And finally, Dr. H. Jack Geiger. Throughout his long life, Dr. H. Jack Geiger not only resisted segregation and discrimination, he understood and took action against the insidious violence of poverty and lack of social and economic opportunity and how it profoundly affected health. Over the decades, Jack helped organize the Medical Committee for Civil Rights during the Freedom Summer of the 1960s. And in the 70s, he was a key activist with Physicians for Social Responsibility, warning of the disaster of nuclear war. And in the 1980s and 90s, he was a founder and leader of Physicians for Human Rights. And perhaps most significantly, he was a founder of the Community Health Center movement in the United States, shown here in Mississippi with Dr. John Hatch. It's tough to emulate him as a role model because we get a Jack Geiger once in a century if we're lucky. Jack finished high school at age 16 and as a white Jewish kid left his home in Brooklyn for Harlem to hang out with Black writers, actors, and musicians during the Harlem Renaissance. After World War II, where Jack served in the Merchant Marines, he attended the University of Chicago as a pre-med student and supported himself as a medical and science reporter. In 1947, there were no Black students and no Black faculty at the University of Chicago Medical School. There were no Black patients in the teaching hospitals. And so in 1947, Jack helped lead a one-day campus protest against racism and segregation at the medical school. More than 1,000 faculty and students came out. A year later, when Jack applied to medical school, he was blacklisted by the AMA, according to him, for his so-called extracurricular activities. And ultimately, Jack was admitted at age 29 to Case Western University in Cleveland. This is what Jack recalled at the time. I was standing in front of the medical school. It was kind of on a hill, and you could look beyond the medical school and see the teaching hospital. And beyond the teaching hospital, you could see the city of Cleveland. It occurred to me that what happened out there in the city of Cleveland and who got sick and who didn't get sick and how that illness was distributed and what happened to people after they got sick and whether they came to this or other institutions and the nature of their interactions were all social as well as biological phenomena. During medical school, Jack traveled to South Africa, where he worked to set up a rural health center linked to the only medical school where non-whites were allowed. There, he witnessed firsthand the health impact of racial segregation under apartheid, but also the deep connections between poverty, poor nutrition, sanitation, unemployment, unequal access to education, and disease. And he realized that one could not treat the individual without treating the community. So back in the US, he urged his medical school to start an inner city community health center. And Jack has captivated generations of medical and public health students with his anecdotes of activism for the right to health, including his famous RX for Food story, when he and his colleagues working in a health center project in Mound Bayou, Mississippi, explained to investigators who were sent down from Washington to find out why were these young doctors using government pharmacy funds for grocery kits. His response to the investigators was, "Last time we looked at our medical texts, the therapy for malnutrition is food." What we learn from Jack, and possibly all the others, is that all medicine is political. As the great 19th century physician Virchow contended, and that professionalism requires a moral compass that must overcome power and conformity. It must involve listening to the pain of individuals and communities and understanding that beyond the doctor-patient relationship is a system that needs to be reckoned with. It must include making historical references, but also having a vision of a better future. It must include being bold and being brave, and seeing the interdependence of health and all human rights, civil, political, social, and economic. It includes forging alliances with others and across disciplines and sectors, and using the power of the pen as well as one's individual voice in whatever context one is confronted with. And of course, it must involve passing these teachings on to the next generations. Thank you very much.
Susannah and Rebecca, this was really a remarkable presentation by both of you. Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions and comments. Let's start at sort of the dilemma that physicians face, taking the Hippocratic Oath and wrestling with these inequities that they're faced with on a daily basis. How would you consider that physicians should deal with these problematic decisions that they're faced with in terms of delivering care that they know is necessary, but also understanding that there are fundamental problems in society that make it difficult for those individuals to remain healthy in their environment. It's a question that we wrestle with as a result of what we're trying to do for science and for medicine, and how we are bound to the Hippocratic Oath of delivering care for everyone who needs it.
Yeah, so I think there are two ways to answer this. One is how an individual doctor or other professional responds in the doctor-patient relationship, and trying to understand as much as possible the larger context, and as Jack Geiger taught so well, the social causes and economic causes of illness and disease, and a person's access to care, et cetera. And of course, in the United States, with the complexities that we've been confronted with so starkly during the pandemic, the disparities, et cetera, the inequities, the cost of medical care, all of those things that come in to the room on top of all the other traumas and burdens and history of their lives, how individual health professional treats a patient, but also understands that there is a whole network of support. And so I think the idea of forging alliances and being able to make proper community-based referrals is really critical, understanding the context that a person is in. I think most of the doctors whose stories I told illustrate that deep engagement with the community. Of course, one individual in the doctor-patient relationship with the system we have can't do it all, can't take care of all those problems, but there needs to be a fabric and a network. That's one. Two is when there's overt wrongdoing, abuse, violence, something that is a human rights violation, I believe that people need to speak out, and they can do that by documenting, as some of the doctors whose stories I told, actually documenting the cases and going public with it, or writing about it in a medical journal, or going to the press, or whatever is the right way for in a particular context to help make a larger change by speaking out and speaking the truth. And I think the forging alliances within the profession is very important, because when, as we've seen even from some of my stories, when the professional associations, colleagues, faculty join together and speak out with one voice, it's much more powerful, because having to do it alone is really hard.
How do you suppose, and maybe this is more a question for Rebecca, how do you suppose the physicians in Germany reconciled what was going on with the acceptance of the Hippocratic Oath?
Right. So, my area of specialty is not the medical profession in Nazi Germany per se, or the doctors, but I would say that there is a common phenomenon across all professionals or people, even ordinary people in Germany, who were asked to participate in, cross ethical lines and participate in exclusion and violence that they never imagined that they would be comfortable doing, that it happened over time. And that I think this history shows that whether it's soldiers or clergy or doctors or whoever, that at first a lot of people were very uncomfortable with doing, and they found it very hard. And that over time, it became easier for people to participate. So I think that along that journey is a process of rationalization, but I think there are other things going on as well.
What about during during the Holocaust? What was the response of religious groups outside of Germany?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, especially in the United States, in North America and the UK, there was a lot of interest in what was going on. There had been, those relationships had been longstanding, and a lot of people took a lot of interest in what was happening in the German churches. And when the Nazis first came to power, and people were still figuring out what this new regime was all about, I think there was a bit of misunderstanding, and people framed it more in terms of religious freedom issues, and like, would the churches be suppressed or repressed and whatnot. But there was a fair bit of information. People knew what was going on. There were a lot of personal contacts and relationships. There were people going over there and coming over this side of the Atlantic. Things were very well known, and so yes, people did speak out, and in other cases sort of saw the churches really as the victims. And we can, in hindsight, we can look back on that and be quite critical of it, because it's clear to us now that the primary section of the population that was being persecuted was not the Christians, but Jews and other parts of German societies. But that's how it was seen at the time.
I'll just maybe add that I'm not an expert on the Nazi doctors per se, but I've certainly read a fair amount about it in the course of my work as well. But thinking about the case of Dr. Koryogen, for example, where Soviet psychiatry officially was able to sort of bracket a whole segment of the population, in this case dissidents, and say that these people were mentally ill, allowed doctors to actually justify an abhorrent situation where they basically did what also the Nazi doctors did, which was othering and sort of pervert the Hippocratic Oath, if you will, or their professional oaths, to say, we're actually making society better, we're healing. And the whole sort of idea of some of the eugenics, as well as the even more extremely experimentation, was that we're going to use science to improve humanity in our society. And they actually perverted the basic concept of medicine in the most grotesque way and justified it to themselves. I mean, similarly, that is some of what happened in the US. I mean, I'm not comparing it directly by any stretch, but the US medical and psychological involvement in the US torture program. In all of these situations, a whole class of people is basically seen as less than human, less deserving of rights, and therefore okay to abuse in the service of the progress in humanity or whatever the other higher value is.
Just following up on that question, when did physicians in the U.S. become aware of the atrocities to the mentally ill in the Soviet Union, and was there any government or religious response?
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. There's several books written about it, and one of the great scholars of this whole phenomenon was a British doctor named Peter Reddaway. But I think what was fascinating in the Soviet Union, of course, there was huge restrictions on freedom of the press and of writing and communication outside. But there was this underground literature called samizdat at the time that was, circulated on little, and information about this form of abuse leaked out quite early. And so, and people knew in the West about Dr. Koryogen and quite early in the, to their credit, the American Psychiatric Association began to speak out about it quite early. And I was actually engaged in the human rights movement, especially focused on the Soviet Union at that time, was very involved in advocacy along with groups like Amnesty International and others for Dr. Koryogen and his other colleagues. He was not the only psychiatrist who was exposed to this kind of repression. And so, and the WPA was extremely active on this because it was really a threat to the profession. And honestly, I don't know that there has been as adequate a campaign globally on similar situations in other countries since. It was very strong, and I honestly wish that similarly there had been as much outspokenness on other things that have happened in recent decades.
So Dr. Winnie would like you to comment on a similar parallel series of events that took place in the United States in terms of slavery, and Dr. Samuel Cartwright, who was involved in exposing this diagnosis of drapetomania, that slaves who ran away frequently would be identified as mentally ill, and how that parallels trying to suppress people seeking freedom.
Well, I wish Dr. Winnie could speak on this. He knows more than I do about this. I mean, what Dr. Winnie is pointing to, though, because I'm not a historian or an expert on the history of this, but is the fact that, these kinds of perversions of medicine and abuses are not unique to any particular country. And as we've seen, even in terms of, I know some of the series that Dr. Winnie has hosted have also looked at how the eugenics movement in the United States actually preceded and even fueled some of the practices in Nazi Germany. And we tend to overlook the fact that, in the United States, hands are not clean. And so I don't know if there's a direct link between what the Soviet psychiatrists did and what was done in the US, but it doesn't surprise me to know this story. Thank you, Dr. Winnie, for pointing that out.
We have a lot more questions, but I'm going to condense them into one question that I'd like both of you to try to address, which is, how do you recommend physicians that want to be involved in rectifying social injustice get involved in doing that? And what are the organizations they should reach out to? How can they best direct their efforts? And how do you recommend people get started?
My answer can be very, very brief because I can only speak to, the history of the Holocaust and the lessons that that might offer for medical professionals today. I think that it is very important to view the Nazi euthanasia program, the T4 program that I spoke about today, within the larger context of the Holocaust. And there are resources at the Holocaust Museum. I can share some links there. And there are other programs and the Colorado Center for Bioethics and Humanities, I know, does some great programming. So I think just learning more about this history in the larger context is all that I can recommend from my professional background, but I'm sure Susannah has really concrete ideas.
Yeah, well, if you don't mind a little promotion for my organization, we are a membership and advocacy organization, Physicians for Human Rights. We're founded in 1986 by a group of doctors, and their legacy is enormous. And we have student chapters. You can connect to our advocacy work and a huge number of resources on our website, phr.org. Pretty easy to remember. We have a student advisory board. We have chapters in about 60 medical schools. And we welcome anyone here to join. You don't have to be a health professional to join. Of course, there are other human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, others that do global research and advocacy. I know that also American Medical Student Association has been very active on a number of these issues. I always urge people to find whatever their passion is and join the organization that really connects to the issue that they feel they can bring the most to, because it could be otherwise overwhelming.
Okay, well, thank you very much to both of you. Both of your talks in terms of the Holocaust and also present day challenges that we all face were incredibly illuminating and help us reflect on the importance of our profession and the roles that we can have in creating social justice. So thanks very much.
Thank you.